Deep in the misty mountains, hidden within a labyrinth of jagged rocks and twisted trees, stood the infamous lair of Dr. Malevolus. A fortress of wickedness, it was said to hold a treasure beyond imagination, locked away behind curses, traps, and creatures of unspeakable horror. Few dared to enter, and those who did never returned. But goblins? Goblins were different. In a dimly lit cave not far from the villain's lair, a group of 5 goblins huddled over a stolen blueprint. Their leader, a wiry goblin with a patchwork coat and a crooked grin, traced a clawed finger across the parchment, nodding excitedly. This was it, the perfect heist. The target? The vault of Malevolus. The prize? A gem said to control the very fabric of reality. Their plan was simple, or at least simple by goblin standards. First, they would sneak through the underground tunnels, avoiding the traps. Then, they would disable the security mechanisms using a mix of poorly understood magic and even worse engineering. Finally, they would crack open the vault, grab the treasure, and be long gone before the villain returned. It should have been easy. It wasn't. The moment they snuck inside, everything started to go wrong. The fortress was far from abandoned. Strange yellow creatures with oversized goggles and a boundless energy buzzed about, fixing machines, carrying weapons, and, most importantly, guarding every door. The goblins had heard of them before. Minions. No one knew where they came from. No one knew why they were so strangely loyal to evil overlords. But one thing was clear. They were everywhere. Still, the goblins weren't worried. Goblins were master tricksters, expert sneaks, and professional troublemakers. Minions? They looked like nothing more than clumsy, banana-obsessed nuisances. This would be easy, or so they thought. Slipping past the first few groups was effortless. The goblins crept through air vents, shadowy hallways, and ancient corridors, bypassing magical tripwires and leaping over pressure plates that would have triggered certain doom. Every step brought them closer to the treasure vault. Then, as they reached a massive steel door adorned with arcane symbols, they made a fatal mistake. One goblin, slightly larger than the rest, tripped over his own feet and slammed headfirst into a lever on the wall. A low, ominous hum filled the air, followed by sirens blaring from every corner of the fortress. The minions turned. A sea of goggled eyes locked onto the goblins, their expressions shifting from confusion to excitement to absolute chaos. And then, all at once, the minions charged. The fortress erupted into pure madness. Goblins scattered, tumbling over themselves as minions rolled, leaped, and catapulted across the hall like bouncing cannonballs. Potions exploded, traps activated, and an entire bookshelf collapsed into a secret passage, revealing an ancient, glowing portal pulsing with raw energy. The goblins had no idea what was happening. The minions had no idea what was happening. But one thing was certain. This heist had just gone horribly, horribly wrong. The goblins had planned for traps, magical defenses, and maybe even an enraged dragon. They had not planned for an army of small, banana-fueled maniacs. Minions poured in from every hallway, wielding whatever they could find. Plungers, frying pans, even a rocket launcher made out of an old vacuum cleaner. They weren't organized, they weren't well-trained, but they were relentless. The goblins scrambled for cover, knocking over suits of armor, tripping over enchanted rugs, and dodging a shower of bananas that, for some reason, had started raining from the ceiling. The goblin leader, still gripping the blueprint, darted behind a statue, panting. He peeked out just in time to see 2 of his teammates being carried off by a dozen giggling minions. One tied up in Christmas lights, the other stuffed inside a barrel. This was bad. A minion leaped at him, wielding a toaster like a battle axe. The goblin barely ducked in time, watching as the minion accidentally catapulted itself through a stained glass window instead. They needed a new plan. Fast. His eyes darted around the chaos. Traps had been triggered everywhere. Blades swung from the ceiling. Magical turrets shot fireballs in random directions. A mystical book had come to life and was chasing a terrified goblin down the hall, shouting ancient curses in Latin. And in the middle of it all, that strange portal hummed ominously, swirling with green and blue energy. Whatever it was, it had to lead somewhere. and anywhere was better than here. With a quick motion, the goblin leader signaled to the others, the ones who weren't tied up, unconscious, or being carried off by minions in a wheelbarrow. To the portal! The remaining goblins bolted toward the glowing gateway, dodging plunger-wielding minions, enchanted floating furniture, and a barrel full of explosive chickens. The minions, of course, noticed immediately, and in their infinite minion wisdom, they decided that if the goblins were going through the portal, they were going too. And so, just as the goblins leaped into the swirling energy, an entire wave of screaming, giggling minions followed right behind them. A blinding flash filled the room. Then, silence. And just like that, they were gone. The world lurched as the goblins tumbled through an endless whirlpool of swirling colors, twisting through a cosmic vortex of pure chaos. Limbs flailed, stomachs churned. One goblin lost his hat, and another lost his lunch. And then, bam! They crashed hard onto solid ground. For a long moment, everything was still. Then, with a groan, the goblin leader rolled onto his back and blinked up at the sky, which was green. That was not normal. Groaning, the rest of the goblins began pulling themselves together, dusting off their coats, counting their fingers, and making sure nothing important had been detached or rearranged during the trip. The minions, on the other hand, had taken 0 damage. In fact, they were already having the time of their lives, tumbling around like they'd just gotten off the world's best amusement park ride. One stood up, wobbled slightly, and then immediately jumped into a nearby bush that screamed and ran away. The goblin leader blinked. That was also not normal. Shaking off their disorientation, the goblins took in their surroundings, and their hearts sank. They were in a forest, but not a normal one. The trees were glowing, the grass was purple, and mushrooms the size of houses loomed over them, releasing glittering clouds of spores. And worst of all, there was a signpost nearby, scrawled in jagged letters that no one wanted to read out loud. It said, "Welcome to the realm of eternal madness. Population, ha 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 ha." The goblins all turned slowly to look at the minions. The minions all turned slowly to look at the goblins. And that's when something screeched in the distance. Something big. Something coming right for them. The goblin leader barely had time to curse his luck before a dozen glowing red eyes appeared in the darkness, and the ground began to shake beneath them. This wasn't just the wrong place. This was the worst place, and now they had to survive it. The earth trembled beneath their feet, sending ripples through the purple grass as the monstrous shape lurched forward from the shadows. The goblins froze. The minions didn't. One of them giggled, pointed at the giant 6-legged nightmare beast, and waved cheerfully. The creature roared in response, its glistening fangs dripping with something that hissed when it hit the ground. The goblins reacted instantly. Survival instincts kicked in. One dove behind a glowing tree, another climbed onto a minion's shoulders, and a third tried to play dead, only to realize he'd fallen into a patch of sentient grass that immediately started tickling him. The minions, however, saw no reason to panic. Instead, one of them casually threw a banana at the monster's face. The goblins collectively held their breath. The monster blinked, looking deeply confused. Then it sniffed the banana. Then, to everyone's horror, it smiled, or at least it tried to, which was somehow worse. A thick, sludgy voice oozed from its many mouths, speaking a language that sounded like 1,000 voices talking backward at once. Nobody understood a word. But then, a minion gasped dramatically and whispered, "Bello!" as if he'd just found a long-lost cousin. The monster nodded. The goblins were horrified. The minions were delighted. The largest minion stepped forward, hands on his hips, and began a full conversation with the 6-legged nightmare monster, complete with exaggerated hand gestures, dramatic pauses, and a lot of pointing at the sky. The goblins exchanged nervous glances. The minion finished his speech with a proud thumbs up. The monster stared. Then, to everyone's complete disbelief, it let out a soft, rumbling chuckle and nodded. The minions all cheered. The goblins were now more afraid than before. Before anyone could process what was happening, the monster suddenly scooped them all up, gently placed them on its massive back, and began sprinting through the bizarre landscape at an impossible speed. The goblins screamed. The minions whooped like they were on a roller coaster. Somewhere in the distance, a new problem was waiting for them. And this was only getting weirder. The monster thundered across the landscape, moving so fast that the wind peeled back the goblin's ears and made the minions' goggles rattle violently. Mountains of floating rocks drifted past. Waterfalls flowed upward. And in the sky, a massive, grinning moon winked at them as they sped toward their unknown destination. The goblins had no idea where they were going. The minions didn't seem to care. And then, just when things couldn't get any stranger, the monster slid to a halt, stopping just inches away from a massive golden gate that shimmered with glowing runes. Before anyone could ask questions, the gates creaked open, revealing an impossibly large castle, built from floating stone slabs, spinning towers, and staircases that led to nowhere. A long red carpet stretched forward, leading directly to a throne made of broken swords and melted treasure chests. And on that throne, a figure sat waiting. The Mad King. Nobody had seen him in centuries. He was rumored to be a powerful, reality-warping ruler who had banished himself to another dimension simply because he was bored of logic. Now, the goblins and minions stood before him, covered in monster slobber, interdimensional dust, and at least one banana peel. The Mad King grinned. It was the kind of grin that made reality itself feel a little unstable. He leaned forward, staring at them with eyes that swirled like a storm. The goblins gulped. The minions waved cheerfully. Then, in a voice that sounded like 1,000 whispers echoing at once, the Mad King spoke. Nobody understood him, but the minions nodded enthusiastically, as if this all made perfect sense. A goblin hesitantly stepped forward and cleared his throat. They had no idea what the Mad King wanted, but they had one goal: get back home before their villain boss returned, and blamed them for literally everything. They needed a deal. And so, after a very confusing negotiation that involved interpretive dance, a juggling contest, and at least one unexpected sword fight, the Mad King finally clapped his hands together. Reality shook. The castle vanished into mist, and suddenly, they were back inside the villain's lair, exactly where they had started. The goblins looked around, stunned. The minions cheered like they had just won a game show. It took a moment for everything to sink in. They had done it. They had escaped the mad dimension, survived the nightmare monster, and somehow made a deal with an all-powerful reality bender. For the first time all night, things seemed okay. And then, the villain's footsteps echoed down the hall. They hadn't stolen the treasure. They hadn't cleaned up the mess. And now, the villain was home. The goblins and minions froze as the villain's footsteps grew louder. They could hear the heavy boots stomping through the halls, the sound of a long, flowing cape swishing dramatically, and worst of all, the deep, menacing growl of someone who had just returned home to find complete chaos. The goblins looked at each other in panic. The minions shrugged, grinning as if this was all just another Tuesday. The villain's shadow stretched across the doorway, and then, the door slammed open. Standing in the doorway was the most terrifying figure any of them had ever seen. A towering presence wrapped in blackened armor, glowing red eyes piercing through the darkness, and a cloak so long and dramatic that it actually billowed despite there being no wind in the underground lair. This was Lord Malakar, the overlord of shadows, the ruler of nightmares, and the most feared villain in all the land. And right now, he looked very, very angry. His gaze swept across the room, taking in the burned furniture, the shattered walls, the weird glowing portal residue still flickering in the air, and the minions innocently whistling while hiding behind a single banana peel. Then, his eyes locked onto the goblins. His voice was like a thunderstorm made of pure rage. "What happened here?" The goblins sweated instantly. The minions high-fived each other for no reason. For a second, nobody moved. Then, one of the goblins did the only thing he could think of. He pointed at the minions. Instantly, the minions pointed right back at the goblins. The goblins pointed at the treasure chest that was still stuck to the ceiling for some reason. The minions pointed at the strange, shifting tear in reality that was still flickering in the air. The villain let out a deep, furious sigh and massaged his temples. It was clear that his patience was wearing thin. That's when the escape plan kicked in. One of the goblins stealthily reached into a pouch. Inside was a single glowing marble, a parting gift from the Mad King, given to them after their ridiculous negotiation in the other dimension. The goblin didn't know what it did, but he really hoped it was useful. With a quick flick of his wrist, he slammed the marble onto the floor. And suddenly, boom! A massive cloud of purple smoke filled the room. The villain roared in frustration, unable to see through the thick haze. And in the confusion, the goblins and minions ran like their lives depended on it. They scrambled through the halls, knocking over ancient suits of armor, jumping over piles of stolen treasure, and dodging the villain's frantically swinging sword as he blindly chased them through the lair. The goblins zigzagged left and right, hoping to lose him. The minions just ran in circles, screaming happily. Somehow, against all odds, they made it to the exit. With one final sprint, they burst through the main doors and dove into the night, leaving a trail of banana peels and goblin footprints behind them. For a long moment, they just lay there, gasping for breath. Then, one of the minions pulled out a single gold coin from his pocket. It was from the villain's treasure hoard. They hadn't stolen the legendary treasure. They hadn't outsmarted the villain, but they had technically taken something. The minions cheered like they had just pulled off the greatest heist in history. The goblins groaned in exhaustion. Then, slowly but surely, they all stood up and disappeared into the night, escaping to cause chaos another day.
If you like this video, then do subscribe to this channel.